Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it is part 2 of my conversation with historian Chris Clark, in which we explore how German history can help us understand a politician like Donald Trump. Today, we're going to be talking a bit about Bismarck. We're also going to be talking a bit about tyrants, emperors, presidents, and kings. And we're also going to be talking about Trump's literature. Chris will be exploring what he thinks we can learn from the art of the deal. Chris, we were talking about an emperor, as you said, Kaiser Wilhelm, a warlord, a hereditary monarch, and alluding to the possible comparisons with Donald Trump. We're going to talk much more about Trump now. But I suppose one place to start is whether it really makes sense to compare a democratically elected politician to a hereditary monarch. People listening to us talking about Wilhelm will have noticed the many ways in which these situations are not analogous. He inherited the throne. He was there for 3 decades. He had a literal court around him. Trump didn't inherit the presidency. He will be gone, I think, almost certainly, in a few years. There is a time limit on it. Presidents are not kings. But do you still think it makes sense? Because temperamentally, there were so many, it seemed to me, points of overlap that you can make that comparison, notwithstanding the fact that democratic leaders are not. There is a movement happening as we speak in the United States, pointing out that America does not do kings. So he has kingly characteristics, but he's not a king.
I don't want to make a case for the comparison because I see it just as an exploratory device, just to hold these things in each other's proximity and see or these people in each other's proximity and see what you might learn from that, rather than to assert or deny the comparability of two singular individuals. I think that, you're right. Of course, he's not a king, and the Kaiser was. The Kaiser was both a king and an emperor in one person, and he inherited that role. And in a way, that's the unique thing about monarchy, and it's also the magic of monarchy, that the constitution, the existence of the state is enfleshed in an individual, which means, among other things, that the entire span of life of that individual is of political interest, from when that person is an infant right through to their death. Royal funerals are highly political events, but so are royal births and baptisms, who's invited, who's not invited, the royal marriages, and so on. We all know about royal weddings. And this applies to heirs to the throne as well as to the people who actually are their incumbents. So, it's a very different picture. But obviously the fact that people are saying, America doesn't do kings, and the no kings movement, if you can call it a movement, does suggest that something is going on around the Trump presidency, which is at least awakening for some people the association with monarchy. And we know that, in response to a no kings demonstration, Trump did something quite remarkable. He published a link on Truth Social to a sort of AI-generated video which showed him as the pilot of an American military jet overflying one of these demonstrations, wearing a king's crown, by the way, a spiky gold crown, which, in fact, of course, I don't need to tell you, you're not allowed to do in the cockpit of a fighter. But there you are. He was wearing a crown rather than a helmet. And as he passed over this demonstration, he sort of pulls this lever in the cockpit, and out of the bottom of the plane fall very large amounts of feces, which then are seen landing on these no kings demonstrators. So he is clearly himself playing with kingship and playing with monarchy. And, they remember the evening after his inaugural where he introduced all the members of his family. That's my beautiful wife. That's my son, Baron. He's very, very tall. Very, very tall indeed. And so it just went through one member of the family after the other. And I must say, I couldn't help thinking of Napoleon III, the sort of epigon of the great Napoleon, who took power after a coup in France in the mid-19th century, and who, one of his first moves, even before he had made himself into an emperor, when he was just the president of the French Republic, was to put huge portraits of his family in the presidential palace. And people started saying, what are all these portraits of his family doing in the presidential palace? The president is there. The family is a private attribute of that individual. And of course, a year or two later, he made himself into an emperor. So there's a lot of playing going on around the idea of monarchy. That's probably not that important. What's more important, I think, is that the Trump presidency has personalized power, and that's what's produced something very like a royal court. I mean, a lot of Trump's utterances are about his feelings. I like that guy, I like those guys, the British guys. I like Keir Starmer. He's a very good guy. Probably the best guy they've got, and so on. I like someone, and then everybody thinks, oh, he likes Keir Starmer. This is good. This has got to be good. So there's a lot of reading the viscera, a lot of sort of, poring over the signs of favor and disfavor. And that is reminiscent of a court. The fact that everybody's interested in his state of mind. Is he upbeat or downbeat on a particular individual or a particular idea? And then I recall, during the first Trump presidency, that meeting where the cabinet were gathered in the White House, people vied with each other. They competed with each other to offer more and more obsequious and servile expressions of loyalty to the president, saying, for example, I just thank God that God gave me the chance to serve under you, and so on. That sort of servility is associated with courts.
One of the things that's interesting about how people talk about Trump is that not never, but very rarely do they think that the most useful explanatory framework is another president, an earlier administration. I almost never read things where people want to compare the Trump administration to what's gone before in American history. The frame of reference is almost always outside the United States. So it could be from, at one end, Hitler or Mussolini, through to Berlusconi, or, as you said, those obsequious cabinet meetings look like the kind of things that you would get in Turkmenistan or, one of those kinds of regimes. But it's as though Trump, to understand him, you need a frame of reference that goes beyond the conventions of the American presidency. There are many aspects of his administration which can only be understood through the conventions of an American presidency because it's still a presidency and it's not free to do whatever it wants. But it is interesting that, and I think people are right. I mean, I think the Berlusconi comparison is more real in many ways, and even Wilhelm II, than to say Trump is like who? Ronald Reagan, George Bush? There isn't really anyone. Or they have to go back to Andrew Jackson, the great early populist. But once you've gone back that far, and also I don't think Andrew Jackson was anything like Donald Trump.
No, what you say is right, that people are doing that. They're looking for, international comparators. But I think that what's striking about this is that it's odd that people should be looking for non-American comparators because no one would deny that Donald Trump is a very American persona, right? I mean, is there anything more American than the opening words of his book, The Art of the Deal? And I quote, I don't do it for the money. I've got enough, much more than I'll ever need. I do it to do it. Right now, that is a very, in its kind of magnificent boastfulness, in its self-pleasure, its capacity to take pleasure in itself. That is a very American utterance. Almost everything about that persona is American. The love of salesmanship, the desire to persuade, the obsession with deals, the adversarial, competitive approach and transactional approach to relationships and negotiations. So it's not that he's an un-American person. So there is something odd about the fact that people are looking for non-American comparators.
So I think the thing is, he's not un-American, he's unpresidential. So people find lots of comparators within the United States. He's like Hulk Hogan, I don't know, he's like Liberace, whatever it is. It's just hard to find a president who embodies that. So that's one of the really striking things about Trump is he is, in many ways, the most American president of them all. But in that way, that makes him unpresidential, or at least unusual, exceptional, filling that role.
Yeah, it would be better to imagine, Liberace as president or Hulk Hogan as president would give you a better set of comparators, except that that's never happened. I'll tell you why I think that people have gone so far abroad and have wandered far and wide to find comparators. And that is what's special about Trump is, I mean, he's clearly, in lots of ways, a very talented individual. And one of the things that strikes me when I see him doing his thing is that he seems to me very happy right now. I think he really enjoys exercising, flexing the sinews of power, especially in the second administration, much happier than he was in the first. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, which we could talk about. But I think what's interesting about Trump, and this is where people start thinking in world historical terms rather than in terms of who else in America has been a similar president, and that is that Trump has a remarkably fresh and uncomplicated and instinctive relationship with power. He has a real feeling for power, which is very, very unusual. And it's odd because, of course, the presidency is an office that wields great power. And yet it's quite unusual for presidents to flex power or to try to flex power in the way that Trump does. What most heads of state and democratic orders do is quite the opposite. I read some time ago the memoirs of Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, the longest serving German Chancellor ever. And in those memoirs, what's really striking is that she never talks about herself as having the power to do anything. She's always hemmed in by other stakeholders in decision-making processes. Decisions arrive, via a very circuitous route as a form of necessity. Something has to be done, and so on. And that's the case in a lot of political memoirs, that people struggle with the idea of decision. Decision is always collegial, and your responsibility for whatever you do is limited by the fact that you're acting from within a big apparatus. There are so many different interests to take account of. The complexity of having to deal with the numbers in Congress, Senate, the military leadership, all the constitutional checks and balances. That whole folklore of checks and balances means that in theory, you don't have very much power. But that's not the world of Trump at all. The world of Trump is one in which power is deployed in a remarkably flowing and free-moving way. And that freedom of action with power is displayed and performed in quite a remarkable way. The holding up of all those pieces of paper with that gigantic zigzag signature at the bottom. I have ordered, I have today seen fit, and so on. Again and again and again, executive orders, or this stuff about tariffs. I mean, I hadn't realized that the American presidency had so much discretion in the question of tariffs. That's a great difference with William II, because Wilhelm II could never have said, I am raising the tobacco tariff, or I'm going to raise tariffs against Russia, because any decision of that kind would first have had to go through the Reichstag and then be ratified by the Federal Assembly, the Bundesrat, before it being signed off into law by the Kaiser. But it seems that tariffs are a very important instrument of international relations, which can be deployed in a relatively single-handed way by the presidency. So clearly he's being advised on this, and he's being told, here are things you can do. These are the levers that you will actually move, the ones you can actually waggle. And if you waggle them hard enough, we'll make a difference. And he's shown an extraordinary instinct for making use of those levers. I mean, another one is intervening on the level of public utterance in economic situations. For example, I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but what economic impact has his claim that Tylenol taken by pregnant women will cause autism in infants? What effect has that had on the sales of that particular drug, or on the company that markets it? What effect have the extraordinary utterances on the subject of vaccines coming out of that administration had on the enormous amounts of business being done with vaccine medications worldwide and in the United States? It's already clear that these initiatives from America and from the Trump administration in particular, including Robert F. Kennedy, of course, have had quite a substantial effect on world vaccine uptake. And therefore, all these things have commercial consequences. And there's even been a discussion of whether some of this isn't a kind of insider trading. You talk down a particular product, you discredit it. There is, of course, an opportunity arises to buy stocks that may be undervalued. And I was very struck recently by Trump's efforts to circumvent the effects of the government shutdown by securing private money to keep the military running while that shutdown is in effect. An act which I take to be unconstitutional and possibly illegal. I don't know. American constitutional lawyers will have to resolve that, and doubtless it's being contested as we speak. But that's another way in which, in a very inventive and a very bold and unembarrassed way, whatever powers can be found in the sort of Wurlitzer organ of the presidency, and it turns out there are more keys in that organ than anybody ever dreamed. Whatever those keys are, he's hammering on them all the time. And that's interesting. I mean, we've not seen that before.
He has this amazing ability to make things that happened not that long ago seem extraordinarily quaint and from another bygone age. So I remember when George H.W. Bush, W's father, expressed his dislike for broccoli. Do you remember this? And it devastated the US broccoli industry because the president said he didn't like broccoli, so children who didn't like broccoli had now the imprimatur of the head of state saying they wouldn't eat their broccoli.
You can imagine the conversation, right? Mr. President, please avoid references to vegetables.
Exactly. And they lobbied the president and he had to make good. It was a bit like the Kaiser, actually. So he reacted a bit like Kaiser Wilhelm II did to his gaffes, which is he accepted a certain kind of level of shame in response to it. And it was understood this was an incendiary thing for a president to have said, because the poor broccoli farmers of America deserve better. The idea that with Trump there would be, first of all, it's a very quaint example, but that had he let slip he didn't like broccoli, that he would have backed down, that he would have responded to pressure. It's the calling card of his presidency to exercise that power in that way. That power, as you said, was always there. Presidents would sort of stumble across it. It's a bit like how Wilhelm sort of stumbled into these situations, and then there was a kind of rescue operation to get him reversed out of them. And when we were talking about Wilhelm, and you said after the Daily Telegraph affair, he more or less took to his bed for 3 years. That's the most un-Trump-like facet of his personality, that he had to retreat from that. Trump takes a step forward.
But it's hard to know whether to be appalled by that or whether just to admire it. I mean, it is an extraordinary capacity. And, it's something, as someone who, at various points in my life, and I'm not going to tell you when or how many times I've been woken at 4:15 in the morning by the thought of some careless remark that might have been a hurtful remark that I'd made at an evening dinner the night before, and that I'd possibly said the wrong thing, or why on earth did I say that? How could I do that? And how do I make it up with the person? I have to try and explain I didn't mean it that way, and blah blah blah. Well, these are things that just do not happen in the life of Donald Trump. I recall the rather nicely chosen phrase in a book by an author whose name I'm now going to forget, but he was someone who'd observed Trump for a certain time to write a portrait about him. And the book ends reflecting on Trump, a man who lives or subsists untroubled, he said, by the murmurings of an inner life. There is no conscience there which is saying, oh, Donald, that was the wrong thing to say. Their feelings might have been hurt. When you read The Art of the Deal, it's full of stuff about how, yeah, I used to make fun of that guy because he was very overweight. So I said, it'd be a better idea for him to spend time losing 200 pounds than to spend his time fighting with me over X, like that. It's this kind of behavior which is so fascinating, an ability to hurt people's feelings, to insult people without any diminution in his confidence or self-doubt or regret. You think of what he said about John McCain, his disrespectful, in fact, insulting references to John McCain as the one who didn't get away. I prefer people who get away. Cain had suffered the most extraordinary things as a prisoner of war of the Viet Cong, and to be treated like that, I would have thought, in a different America, that would have been instant political death for someone in Trump's position. It seems to have made no difference to him whatsoever.
Oh, and at various points in his career, the assumption has been that he had just committed political suicide. The grab 'em by the pussy tape, which was, I still remember vividly watching talking heads on American TV declaring the death of Donald Trump's political career, and one or two people saying, you have no idea of the country that you live in. You're talking about this as though rules that you have grown up with still held, and they don't.
They clearly don't. So there's been an extraordinary moment of disinhibition. And that disinhibition, I think, has deeply transformed political styles. One of the important things, I think, which plays into Trump's handling of the presidency is the falling away of a certain idea of politeness and decorum, which I suppose people used to think. I guess there was a time when people thought politeness was a sort of secondary virtue, not very much weight. But actually, it turns out politeness is quite important. I thought when he remarked, for example, an anchor woman for Fox TV, Megyn Kelly, who had interviewed him in a way he didn't appreciate, and he then said, well, it was because she was having her period, and there was blood, I could see blood coming out of her, what's it? And he later claimed he meant her eyes, right? Blood was coming out of her eyes. Well, there again, I thought this has got to be the end, because I've always thought of America as a place placed a high value on courtesy, especially between men and women, courtesy towards women in public life. And it made no difference. And the question is why, and I don't have a good answer to that, apart from saying that clearly some of the sort of unempathetic, attacking, unrestrained language of social media have now entered the political domain in a way that was unthinkable 15 years ago, and that they've transformed the whole index of utterance.
Those two things that are both, I think, true about Trump. One, as you say, he has an extraordinary level of comfort with power. He breathes in the air of power in a way that feels natural, and he moves through that space without much self-reflection. And that he's untroubled by an inner life. And yet the level of skill that he seems to show, the bare bones of his career, the arc of his career, it must suggest a deep understanding of some of the contours of power. He doesn't just breathe it and live it. He must reflect on it at some level. He must have and an ability to learn as well. So this seems to me one way in which he's probably not like Wilhelm II, in that he is, in political terms, someone who learns. His second term is very different from his first term. So this may or may not be stretching it. But do you think, therefore, there is a comparison to be made with someone that we talked about briefly in the previous episode, but we could say more about now? Bismarck, one of his characteristics was his comfort with power. He understood it, and he was very unafraid to deploy it in a way that allowed him to dominate a world in which there were all sorts of people operating in all sorts of ways, but he was probably more comfortable with the deployment of power than anyone else in his environment.
That's a really interesting observation. I think when you compare the two administrations, then in the first administration, he often did seem a bit at sea, in public. I mean, Trump now, not Bismarck, who never seemed at sea. But I think that at that point he was really still finding his way. In the second administration, he's clearly much better supported by a phalanx of people around him he's being very well managed and backed up. And this has allowed another feature of his in the first administration, people were thinking about the singularity of a personality. What kind of guy is this? Have we ever seen anyone like this before in this sort of position? And now what's evident is the kind of skill and a sort of dexterity in the management of tasks, including, of course, most obviously communicative tasks, which he seems to manage with split-second instinctive responses to handle communicative challenges very effectively, at least in the light of his own objectives. But also, when you see him deploying power in an unembarrassed way, I do sometimes think about Bismarck. It's interesting because I went and reread The Art of the Deal the other day when I was thinking about exactly this question. And The Art of the Deal, I mean, there's lots of stuff in it that obviously doesn't make one think of Bismarck. But on the other hand, there's also quite a lot that does. I mean, he says, for example, maximize your options. I protect myself by being flexible. I never get too attached to one deal or one approach. For starters, I keep a lot of balls in the air. Well, about Bismarck, it was often said he had too many balls in the air, literally. He was the juggler who everything was always in the air. When would these balls come down and what would happen when they did? Why was it so difficult to predict what Bismarck would do next? Why were people who were Bismarck's best friends suddenly left gasping at the insults meted out to them? And suddenly it turned out he had new friends. He was cuddling up to some other faction because they were now of use and not they. So there's a point of comparison in that sort of, an openly tactical way of dealing with power. Another point he makes at one point is he says, always fight back. He says, there are times, he says, when the only choice is confrontation. Well, that's another thing that it's unusual to hear from a leader in a democracy. Leaders in democracies are supposed to be interested in consensus. That's what you're always told. That's the virtuous position. We're building a consensus. All the stakeholders, we brought them all together we've got a round table and so on. Well, not Trump. Trump says sometimes you just have to really attack your enemies. And Trump will quite often goad and provoke almost for the sake of it, except it's not quite just for the sake of it, because Bismarck was like that too. Bismarck began his career by insulting the people on the other side of this early kind of version of the Prussian parliament, the United Diet. He would simply stir them up and goad them until they exhausted themselves in expressions of outrage and wounded pride and so on. And he did that because he recognized that situations of harmony are deceptive. When everybody's getting on, you don't really know who your enemies are. But if you throw out really insulting, provocative bits of behavior and utterance, then the enemies will appear. People will come up. And once the heads pop up, you know where to direct fire. So conflict is more revelatory than harmony. And now it's for a person who's used to the sort of norms of a polite democracy, that's a very counterintuitive way to handle power. But Trump doesn't only do that, he does it very skillfully.
Our old friend Dominic Cummings, who has spent half of his life trying to compile a chronology of every moment in the life of Bismarck and is obsessed with Bismarck. The most Trumpian moment in British politics in my lifetime was the period around the proroguing of Parliament. So I don't think people at the time particularly thought of it as Trumpian. They thought of Johnson as a Trumpian prime minister. But actually, in that Bismarck sense, I remember at the time thinking, because howls of outrage, absolute. It was like sticking a stick into a beehive, the way it provoked the liberal elites of Britain to not just stick their heads above the parapet, but sort of run around screaming their heads off. And 4 months later, Johnson had a thumping majority in the House of Commons. It then went wrong after that. But it was engineered precisely in order that the ultimate shocking, goading act should flush your enemies out so that they are lined up in a place where you can deal with them. And it was that sequence of events that won Johnson his majority in Parliament. And it then and now it struck me as quite Trump-like. And yet the way in which it's not Trump-like is it was very calculated. And that's the difference potentially between the Bismarckian and the Trumpian version of this. I mean, Bismarck clearly did have an inner life, didn't he? We're not assuming that Bismarck was someone who didn't have that voice inside him that was reflecting on what he was doing in the way that we think maybe Trump doesn't.
Well, let's come back to Bismarck's inner life. I mean, Bismarck was one of the great intellects of his era. I mean, his memoirs, Gedanken und Erinnerungen, are just a masterpiece of German 19th century political prose. I mean, they're just a great piece of 19th century literature, full stop, in any language. If he'd been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, well, it would have raised some eyebrows, obviously, but nevertheless, you could see what the reasoning might be. So that's not Trump. I mean, nobody's going to give Trump the Nobel Prize for the art of the deal. And he's a culturally complex person with a very sophisticated sense of his own place in history and so on. But in a way, none of that matters very much. In the end, it does come down to the tactical verve of someone who knows how to play cat and mouse with a parliament, which Bismarck did. Bismarck was brilliant at that. Goad the liberals, create an unworkable situation, a German version or a Prussian version of a government shutdown, then say, okay, the parliament's not cooperating, we'll rule without the parliament under a special article in the constitution, invoking the theory of the constitutional gap, the gap which you have to fill when Parliament's no longer part of the process or no longer wishes to be part of the process. And then he did that for a while, then he came back, made friends with the Liberals again, gave them an indemnity bill to sign. They embraced him because he'd just won a war and so on. In the end, it does come down not just to tactical skills, but also the willingness to deploy them, just the willingness to operate in that way with something like a parliament, rather than to think of yourself as the loyal servant of the parliament or as, just another parliamentarian, the prime minister, who is himself a member of that body, if you're looking at the British case, and so on. And, that's really what's extraordinary about Trump, I think, is this readiness to operate tactically without too much in the way of constitutional reservations.
How much in Trump's case do you think that has to do with the fact that he had never worked for an organization? Not only was he not a politician, America has had presidents who are not politicians before. It's had generals who have become president. Hoover wasn't really a politician. He was a businessman, engineer, and then administrator. But they had always worked for vast organizations. They had worked within vast organizations. Trump came into the presidency never having worked for anything that wasn't already his own. He really made himself through The Apprentice. I think The Apprentice is the key. The Art of the Deal and Trump as the businessman is not nearly as significant, I think, as the period when he was the most popular TV star in America. I mean, it was the number one show in America. But he came into the presidency as a businessman, as a TV star, always running his own show, very limited experience of bureaucracy and administration, and presumably always viewed it as an unnecessary encumbrance. There has never been a president like that, even the non-politicians one. So I think it's not just that he's not a politician. And of course, this does make him different, I think, from Bismarck as well. He came into this as a kind of political virgin.
I mean, you say that's different, but actually, Bismarck was in politics for a long time. Trump can't be in politics at this level for that long because of the constitutional limits on the number of terms. But Bismarck didn't come into politics via the civil service, which is the usual thing to do. And he remarked in his own memoirs, he said, I was brought into politics by revolution. It was the revolution of 1848 that gave him the opportunity to fuse in his own life his idea of what he was for and where he was headed with the destiny of his country. So he came in from left field. He was not a professional politician. He became a very gifted politician, but only simply by doing it for so long, and also by virtue of his native intelligence and verve, and also his capacity for anger, which was, one of the things that drove him. He was an anger-driven life form. So it's not as big a difference as one might think. But I think it's interesting what you say. I mean, it's true as well what you say about The Apprentice, that The Apprentice showed him as the person who makes decisions. You're fired. You're not fired, but you are fired. I'm appraising, I'm evaluating, and on the basis of that, I'm sacking someone. But he had to be trained to do that. There was a lot of training to make Trump into the person that became the hero of The Apprentice. So he owes a lot to those television executives who set that up, that role for him up, and made him look decisive, if not presidential. I mean, there's an interesting, I say this without having really thought about it, but it would be interesting to think about Trump's relationship with the process of decision making. Decision making is a complicated thing, and I'm not sure how much we know about how the decisions around and by Trump are actually how they're made and who's really making them. A lot of what's going on right now seems to me to be conforming fairly closely to the Heritage 2025 template. So it may be that there's quite a large, collegial group helping to keep him on the straight and narrow and steer him towards objectives that will fulfill that agenda.
And I do find myself wondering about the question that we touched on when talking about Wilhelm II, which is what would happen with Trump when the decision is such that he can't personalize it, in the sense that there could be, let's hope it doesn't happen, but there could be in his second term a decision to be made about war, or a decision to be made even on economic matters where the stakes are so high, where the ramifications are so broad that even Trump can't see it as an extension of his personality. I may be wrong. Maybe he can see even nuclear war as an extension of his personality. But I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I don't think that has been put to the test. And I think it is possible, actually, that certain kinds of decisions he would find very difficult and might even overwhelm him. I think he's in his sweet spot now. He's really in his golden zone. Tariffs, early in his term, his enemies are in disarray. The Democratic Party is in disarray. He's got the media where he wants them commenting on his every move. But actually, to this point, the stakes aren't yet existential.
And he's also, people mock this. They say, this is all he's been, trying to work his way into inveigle himself into a Nobel Peace Prize. And it does seem that that is quite a serious preoccupation. But, there's an upside to that. Isn't it good for the most powerful political office holder in the world to fancy himself as a peacemaker? I think it is a good thing. Better at least. I mean, there are kind of mixed messages here, aren't they? Renaming the Ministry of Defense Ministry of War and announcing, as he did, that America would now begin nuclear testing on the same footing as nuclear testing in China and Russia and so on. So there's some mixed messaging there, but I think Trump doesn't like war. He sees war as wasteful, disorganizing, bad for real estate. War is by and large not good for buildings, and he likes buildings. We know he's very fond of buildings. He's invested a lot of money and emotion in buildings. You were talking down the art of the deal. I think the art of the deal, you're right, it's not the key to his journey to the presidency, but it is the key to who he is.
No, I don't want to talk down the art of the deal. I was trying to talk up The Apprentice. I think these two are both absolute linchpins of the Trump story.
They fit together, they dovetail together very nicely, but the thing I had in mind was a comment he makes in The Art of the Deal, where he's talking about work that's being done on the construction of his triplex. I didn't even know what a triplex was, but a sort of 3-floor assembly of rooms and so on in Trump Tower for his own apartment. And he says, "In truth, I've gone a little overboard. What I'm doing is about as close as you're going to get in the 20th century to the quality of Versailles."
The line that I read to you from your book about Wilhelm. So if we replace Tsar with Putin, he was angry with Putin one week, but infatuated with him the next. He reacted with fury to perceived slights and provocations, but panicked at the prospect of genuine confrontation or conflict. Were tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, Russian tanks to roll in to the Baltics, or a shooting war to start the wrong side of the border with Poland, I think Trump would react with panic rather than fury. I think his decisionism, his apprentice-style decisionism, does not suit that. And that, to me, is quite like Wilhelm, actually.
Yeah, I think, of course, these are speculations, but I think he would not relish that situation. He doesn't want it to come up he doesn't seek it, let's put it that way. He doesn't want to play chicken. That's an interesting thing. He's not playing chicken with anyone. And that in itself is interesting. In that way, his, whatever you think of his style is very abrasive and can be quite insulting to particular people he doesn't like. And incidentally, in The Art of the Deal, he says, I don't go easy on my enemies. I do press hard when I know who they are. But he's not looking for conflict, and he would doubtless find that sort of decision very difficult. It's not clear that he would be the one who would make that decision. I think that there he would be in the hands of, simply by virtue of the way in which the intelligence needed to make these decisions flows together, he would be in the hands of a lot of other people, in particular military experts and so on. So it's hard to know how he'd respond to that, but it's quite clear already that he doesn't seek it or relish it.
You said of Bismarck that there is now a revisionist view that he wasn't simply managing his Kaiser Wilhelm I, that he was himself capable of being managed. And you said of Trump that one of the differences between his second term and his first term is that he's being better managed. He was a creation of the producers of The Apprentice. We're talking about The Art of the Deal as though he wrote this book. He didn't write this book. It was written with and for him. And yet he does convey, currently in his second term, a real sense of control and self-control, actually. I even think the self-control is more visible than it was before. It feels like he knows what he's doing. His outbursts, his lunacies, and some of the things he says are just gibberish now, but it feels like they fit a template that he is comfortable with. So do you think he's more managed than managing at the moment? Is it even possible to say, or is it always in these cases a impenetrable mix of the two?
Well, this debate has cropped up in the aftermath of the appearance of these revisionist publications saying it was the Kaiser really who called the shots. And the point has been made that it's not an either or. It's not the Kaiser versus Bismarck. They were working together and they had common objectives. And in fact, one point one could make about that is that when the Kaiser celebrated his 80th birthday, Bismarck sent him a postcard in which with a picture of the building in which they had often worked together in the office where they had often met. And he said, I send this to you, in with my deepest esteem, and as a reminder of the many world historical decisions we made together over the last X years. So that's, I think, the way these things work when they're working well, and I think that's something like that is happening in the case of the Trump second term, that decisions are being curated and distilled out of an apparatus, consisting of people who have different interests and, represent a kind of quite a broadly constellated and probably quite diverse and not very homogeneous body of right-wing groups. And this has been quite, as far as we can tell, quite well handled. I mean, there is still the sort of off-message sort of bloats which happen just are impossible to stop, and that is something that he has in common with Germany's last Kaiser, who was a kind of like a sort of Tourette's tick at the heart of the German political system. Well, there are moments like that with Trump still, moments when he seems to wander off message or where he just talks gobbledygook or whatever. But he doesn't really care, and increasingly nobody else cares either. They just say it's happening again. People love it. It doesn't seem to make any difference to anything. He can stand up and say banana, 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 and sit down again, and everybody would applaud, and we move on. That's not decision making, and people, I think, realize that power is being wielded in quite a systematic way for particular objectives, and among other things, the state is being dismantled. That's an extraordinary, or parts of the state are being dismantled. In particular, those parts of the state that are concerned with regulatory mechanisms, especially the regulation of commercial activity. And that's very interesting and that's very systematic. It's not as if there's just been a sort of random interaction with those structures. They've been disappearing one after another. And, the administration has made clear announcements to the effect that certain regulatory commitments will no longer be honored, or that certain regulatory bodies have hitherto been shut down or have been defunded. So there's definitely system there. So yes, it's interesting to put it as you do. Does this mean he's learning to take instructions? And I think probably the answer is yes. Partly there are more people he can trust, so he's able to, receive a steer, take a steer. He's not always pushing back against everybody around him. There's a lot of that going on in the first administration. And the Kaiser too had this problem that he said, all of you know nothing. I alone know everything. He was basically expressing his frustration at the fact that so many people around him knew more about the important stuff than he did. Well, that's not happening anymore. The new administration is much more aligned. And the process by which, the contest among ideas within this quite heterogeneous milieu is being filtered through into clear guidelines. That's all happening behind the back of house, as it were. And the process of triage that produces initiatives from the top is much better managed.
An American president who perhaps had an equivalent Bismarckian level of comfort with the deployment of power was Lyndon Johnson. We partly know this because he is the subject of the most famous and also most in-depth political, psychological, personal biography of any American president, Robert Caro's 4-volume, meant to be 5 volumes. We don't think the 5th volume will ever appear. Maybe it will. But it particularly when Johnson was Master of the Senate, to use the title of one of those books, an astonishing willingness to use power in all of its facets. And it was the air that he breathed. He had a natural comfort with it. But the 4 volumes of that biography by Caro of Johnson also have in them a line which has become very famous. And I just want to know what you think about it in relation to Bismarck, Wilhelm, Trump. I want to know what you think about it as someone who does this for a living, studies these people. Caro said, power doesn't just corrupt, it reveals. And actually what it mainly does is it reveals. When these people reach the point at which the power is really great, that's when you see who they really are. And I've never believed that. I don't think that's true, in the sense that I feel that you can see who these people were before they acquired this power. It's not Trump as president has shown us who he is. Bismarck showed us who he was when he acquired that power. You can see who these people are before the power. And in some ways, the power distorts more than it reveals. At a certain point, it becomes harder to see who they are. I may be wrong, but I've always found that line a little jarring. It's very plausible. Power doesn't just corrupt, it reveals, but does it?
Well, let me just start by saying what a fantastic achievement those 4 volumes are. And I hope there is a 5th volume. And I wish Robert Caro all the best, because it's some of the most riveting historical writing I've ever read. And in particular, the volume you mentioned, Master of the Senate, is just a masterpiece. I mean, he should get the Nobel Prize for Literature for that book. It has once gone to a historian of the Roman Empire called Mommsen, and it should go to Caro. I mean, it's exactly that feature of the portrait that you refer to, the watching this man, swimming in power like a fish swimming in water, and the brilliant way in which he exposes, for example, in that particular volume, Master of the Senate, the anatomy of the Senate. How does the Senate work? And the Senate building is anatomized like a gigantic animal. It's like looking at the insides of a huge manatee or something, and understanding how the different chambers communicate with each other. Where does the blood and information flow, and which bits control which other bits, and where do you have to be to get certain bits of information, and so on. So magnificent achievement. But now to come to this observation, and the question as to whether power reveals or distorts. I think the claim that it reveals is a bit problematic in the case of Trump, because I think if you look back, it's not as if Trump was a very mysterious persona. I think we already knew the kind of person Trump was. Was he already a transactional person? Yes. I mean, sorry to come back to the art of the deal. There's a bit where he talks about playing with blocks with his brother as a kid. And he said, my brother wanted to make some kind of, loser garage or a garage or whatever. He said, I wanted to make a very high building. So I asked him if I could use his blocks. So he said he borrowed the brother's blocks and made this super high building with the block. And the brother said, you can have them, but only if I can have them back after. And he said, of course, of course. And then he built this enormously high tower. And he said, but then when my brother was out of the room, I glued the blocks together. So he never got his back. So, the point is that it's not as if he became a different person when he had power. He was still that guy.
And it's not as if hidden depths were revealed either.
No. And in a way, that's sort of reassuring. He really is the guy that people thought he was. Actually, there's a kind of book about Trump by Brendan Sims and Charlie Lederman, which just simply compiles all his statements about stuff and then compares them to what he did when he came to power. And the argument it makes is, actually, WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. Trump is always telling you what he's going to do, and then he actually does or tries to do those things. There's a straightforwardness about the man, which, is good or bad. I mean, the difficulty we have with Trump is that Trump upsets and insults and horrifies a lot of people, and quite often with good reason. But then it's so important not to just switch off your brain because you disapprove of something. We have to try and keep thinking through all the outrage and so on. then on the other question, does power distort? Well, I think the distorting effect of power on our perception of Trump is an evidence in the sense, I suppose, that power does change everything. I mean, this is a phenomenon that was alluded to by the Austrian legal theorist Georg Jelinek, who referred to the normative power of the factual, die normative Kraft des Faktischen. That sounds better in German. But the point being that once power flows into a particular order of things, once it's sustained by power, it starts to look very normal and legitimate. Power has this way, people, or humans rather, have this way of acclimatizing themselves, orienting themselves to a particular order of power and coming to see that as legitimate. Nobody wants to be in a position where they're constantly uncomfortable with the power that's wielded around them. They would rather go with the flow. And so that normative power of the factual is extraordinary. Once power becomes a fact, it becomes legitimate. It comes to be seen as legitimate. And I think that's what's happened with Trump, that, we're perceiving him now as the sort of fountainhead of power. And that makes him, simply by definition, in a way, not ridiculous. It makes him very, very important and very worth listening to. And it makes it important to keep listening and keep trying to understand. And ridiculing him or denouncing him as a sociopath, although he may well have sociopathic features, as many other human beings have and do, is not the way forward. We've got to keep thinking about him as a person who's wielding power and understanding what his power means and what he does with his power means. Both of these ideas, that power reveals and that power distorts, those perspectives have in common, I think, the problem that they see power as something that's somehow independent of people, that it's something out there. And, here I am, I'm Donald Trump. There's no power around, and now there's some power around, and I'm different. Well, it's not quite like that, because power is not an attribute. You can't sort of say, I got some power today, I got 5 kilograms of power in this travel bag. Power is a purely relational characteristic. It's a characteristic of the relations between people and institutions. And that makes it very difficult to pin down. It's always in motion. And what I think is essential to the mastery of Trump is the fact that he stays on the initiative. He keeps generating new controversies, generating new waves of shock, new surprises. And by that means, he keeps pulling power back to himself. He knows he has to do that, because if he didn't, it's like a shark, drowning in the water if it doesn't keep moving the water through its gills. If he doesn't do that, power may well drain away from him, either towards, the big wigs within his own network, or towards Congress, or towards some other body. And so power is not this thing outside ourselves. It's both a feature of who we are and part of what makes us who we are, but also a relational characteristic of particular situations, which has to be constantly managed and curated.
And I suppose you could therefore say that one of the ways in which power, in the other sense, the thing that you acquire as you move up the greasy pole until at the top you are, in theory, in possession of more of it than you had when you were at the bottom. One of the things that amount of power reveals is whether the person has an instinctive understanding of what you just described. And if you contrast, say, Trump with Keir Starmer, it seems to me that Keir Starmer, we have learnt something about him since he became prime minister, which is that he is not comfortable, actually, breathing that air or swimming in that water. He's a lawyer and he feels permanently almost at odds with what you need to do to move through that space. It's become very bitty and fragmented, and he's not the master of it at all. And maybe we could have known that about Starmer before he became prime minister, but I think it's been laid bare. And with Trump, the opposite is true. In his second term, when it was lined up in a way that he was more personally comfortable with, not least because he feels vindicated. I mean, a huge part of his story that the American people re-elected him in the face of everything that was thrown at him in the intervening period. He's living his best life, absolutely, at the moment. But we also have learnt of him that when the opportunity arises, he can swim in those waters with some ease. And that is a bit of that power reveals thing that I think I do understand. Maybe it was true. Actually, of Johnson, you could almost say that he was less comfortable as president than he was as majority leader in the Senate. The Senate was that was his ocean to swim in. And actually, he found the White House much more difficult. There's something about Trump that the White House does seem to be his happy hunting ground. And number 10 Downing Street is not Keir Starmer's happy hunting ground at all.
No, it's not. And I think that's true, but it's curious that we want, or that we are excited by statesmen or stateswomen who behave like Trump, because in a way we're traducing our own commitment to the sort of relatively institutionalized form of democracy that we live under or with or through. And, the whole point of modernization theorists, one of the key sort of strands of modernization that was theorized as central to the process by which societies become more modern was the depersonalization of power. The idea being that in pre-modern societies, power is wielded by some local castellan with lots of horses and armed men. And if you don't do what he says, pretty soon he'll come around and burn your crops or maybe kill you and the rest of your family. And the idea is we got out of that not very good situation into one where power was wielded through laws and courts. And if you are punished for some misdeed, you're not punished by the will of some lord. You're punished by the abstract power of the law. And we all want that to be the case. And one not unimportant feature of the Trump presidency has been its disrespect for the rule of law and its willingness to play hardball with judicial personnel, judges in particular, and to push hard back against the authority of courts and the dignity of courts. And so there's a difficult decision to be made there. It's kind of fun. It's like an Olympic discipline, seeing someone apply these really enormous tools to the problems that they face. There's a lot of drama in that. There's a kind of gladiatorial drama. It's bred in circuses. But on the other hand, that's really not how a potentially rather somnolent business of democratic governance ought to be happening. So we have a problem that, our thirst for entertainment and our desire to live in accountable and complex systems in which complexity is part of the way in which they're managed are in conflict.
Of Starmer, I think, not just because he's a lawyer, but by temperament, he's almost the embodiment of the modernization theory that you just described. And it doesn't just say something about us and our appetite for show, but also it does say something about the world that we live in the third decade of the 21st century, that form of politics is really struggling. And we can regret that, and we don't need to celebrate the Trumpian version, but we can also recognize that that way of exercising power, because it is still a form of power, is facing an uphill battle. And I don't think it's simply because Donald Trump is president of the United States.
No, it's not simply because Donald Trump is president of the United States. I mean, he's not the only example. I mean, there are many other comparable figures, actually. One that I'm particularly interested in at the moment is Javier Milei, the Argentinian president, who's in many ways a sort of analogous figure. And of course, Trump has done a great deal to support him and help to, rescue him from his popularity crisis in Argentina, so that he's done much better than expected in the most recent Argentinian elections. But I think that turning against the state, this assault on the state and hatred of the state, which is also something that marks out Millet. He talks about the state as a toxic, deadly apparatus which kills freedom, but also kills people. This is where the anti-statism of the right blends with anti-vaxxers, because anti-vaxxers use vaccines as examples of state killing programs. States driving hundreds of thousands of children into autism and early death and so on. And that's how you get to this extraordinary rhetoric of the state as a poisonous apparatus. That's a really remarkable feature of right-wing discourses right now, is this hostility to the state and its structures, which runs right against a whole tradition, starting with Hegel, by which the state is seen actually as a liberating device. The state emerges. When the state emerges, one of its tasks is to raise people out of localized forms of politics, which are actually extremely manipulative, and in which power is personally wielded in a very asymmetrical way by wealthy, powerful people over poor and powerless ones. And it's the state that pulls us out of that and gives us a stake in an order that's not exactly equal, but at least involves some kind of equal access to participation and opportunity. And I think one thing that's often overlooked is that the assault on state structures, and in particular regulatory structures, the shutting down of funding for key ministries, and the generally anti-state affect of the current administration, this is also an assault on democracy, because the state is part of democracy. When you think democracy is just about elections, it's not just about elections. The state is one of the ways in which the people holds a stake in the future of the nation, because the state is the organ that looks after the cleanliness of public waterways, for example, or the management of national parks, or defense, all sorts of things that pertain to the interests of the population as a whole are managed by the state. So when you attack the state, that can, as it were, contribute to a radical privatization of power. It's not just about the old liberal argument about, free enterprise versus trade unions and restrictive legislation.
And to go back to finish where we started, that is one way in which Donald Trump is not Kaiser Wilhelm II, because Wilhelm believed in the state. His fight with Bismarck at the beginning was not a fight between someone who wanted to tear it down and someone who wanted to build it up. Two different visions, fully committed visions of the power of the state.
Yes, under the rule of Wilhelm II, the Prussian state, which was seen as one of the largest and most progressive states in Europe, grew to an unprecedented size. And the Kaiser, another interesting point of difference is that the Kaiser Wilhelm II was a great supporter of the most recent science. And he was a tremendous financer and investor in scientific research. And the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute became, one of the most important research foundations in Europe. And Germany produced not a few, outstanding scientists in all kinds of cutting-edge areas of the natural sciences at that time. So lots of differences there, but still the same old questions about what power is and how it's wielded.
Next time on PPF, we're also going to be doing something a bit different and on a completely different scale. I'm going to be talking to the paleontologist and science writer Henry Gee about the life of the species, the past, present and future of Homo sapiens. When did we reach our peak as a species? When did we go into decline? How long might we have left? I think you'll find the answers to all of those questions surprising and sobering. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.